Hello and welcome to the Leading Lives podcast this week. Today's guest on the show is former Commando and Veterans Minister Johnny Mercer. We're going to be chatting through Johnny's life story and then focusing on the struggles that veterans still face today. I've had some questions sent in from veterans too, so it's going to be an entertaining programme. Morning, Johnny. Thanks for coming in. And how are you doing?
Pleasure. Yeah, really good. Thanks. Good to be here.
You're from a big family, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
And how many siblings is it?
7.
Wow, 7. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that like at meal times when you were a kid?
Busy. Yeah, get in there, get done, get out. Yeah.
Fair enough.
That's good. Yeah.
Religion was quite a big part of your early life, is it?
Yeah. I grew up in a sort of cult-like existence,
Really?
which was quite interesting.
Yeah.
But it was obviously good to get out of that and get into the military. And
Your family background, as far as I could see, wasn't military.
Yeah.
So what drew you towards the military?
basically to get away from home as fast as possible. And
Really?
I think that was the same for my brothers.
Right.
And and it worked. And look, I never set out to be, I was never sort of dressed up as an army chap when I was 5 years old, running around with fake guns. For me, it was a chance to improve my life chances, to make friends, to do a lot of events training, play a bit of sport, and then, obviously leave. But 9/11 changed a lot of that for me and obviously a whole generation of us.
My childhood led me ultimately into a career in banking, which I
Right.
know is close to your family heart, and I couldn't wait to get out of it.
Yeah.
It was.
Well, my dad ran the local Lloyd's Bank. I mean,
Oh, really?
he's not a
Okay.
banker. No.
I was Barclays.
Excellent, great.
You joined the military, rose to the rank of lieutenant, and then you took on the all arms commando course. How
Yeah.
was that?
Good, yeah. I think I left as a captain in 2014.
Yeah.
I enjoyed my entire service existence. It was great fun. Really good people, but obviously a very shaping experience as well with the time that I served and the roles that I was doing.
Let's talk for a minute or two about the Commando course, because that's a very challenging thing, and it's not open to new entrants into the military, is it?
See, the original commandos were in the army, right?
Yeah.
So I served in the last remaining commando regiment, which was 29 Commando. I think there's another one now in the engineers. But I wanted to be a commando, and I didn't want to be in the infantry, but I wanted to have a skill set and be able to perform technical skills in combat. And 29 was the place for me, and I fell in love with Plymouth, and I fell in love with the unit and the blokes who were serving there, and I was extremely fortunate to get posted there and to have so much fun.
I a couple of weeks ago actually had a guest on here. His name's Mick Hawkes.
Yeah.
He was in 29 Commando as well.
Great.
And he went from there into the SAS.
Right.
And his episode was quite eye-opening actually, Johnny.
Good.
Yeah. You mentioned about being a captain. I had in my notes that by the time you went to Afghanistan, you'd risen to the rank of captain. And I want to talk for a little while actually about your time in Afghanistan and how that shapes you today, really, as well as what we're going to cover within this. So, describe the experience of being in Afghanistan.
Certainly not a uniform experience. So people have different roles, and I certainly had different roles as well. I mean, there was a time when I was embedded with the Afghan army, which was okay, but a bit dull and pretty challenging day to day because these people are pretty out of control. I did a tour with UKSF as a non-badged guy, which was great fun as well. And then I did a ground holding tour where essentially we had to occupy and hold a patrol base for one of the fighting seasons in 2010. And to be honest, that was pretty brutal. And I think a lot of people who went through that experience, whatever they went on to do afterwards, look back on that as the kind of real professional challenge of that era.
How did you deal with the mental trauma of knowing that literally you had the life in your, their life in your hands, your colleagues? How did you deal with that?
Well, I think a lot of the time I was thinking about trying to stay alive myself, really, and that was half of it. But look, I mean, combat is an extraordinarily addictive drug as well, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously it's terrifying, and obviously it's horrific when people are injured, but it's right on the cusp of life, right, where you're dealing in very sort of rarefied air. I thrived on that challenge. I enjoyed the consequences of the actions. I enjoyed the challenge of controlling myself and leading blokes in extremely challenging situations. And to be honest, that's what I wanted to do, right? From the earliest days when I joined up and 9/11 happened, and you think, what do I want to do? I wanted to lead blokes in combat and close with and kill the enemy, and work in teams in the British Army, which for me has always been this extraordinary institution that I respect, and has done wonders for me and countless thousands of others who've served in its ranks.
When you were in Afghanistan, how different was it to what your perception was before you got on the plane to go there?
I mean, I'd never been anywhere like that before in terms of the heat, the smell, the really sort of binding dust that gets everywhere. I didn't really enjoy it in places like Bastion, where there's the big camps, and I didn't enjoy that side of it. I loved being in the austere environments, where it was kind of, in my view, like the purest form of soldiering, right? So you're in patrol bases, the Taliban or whoever are trying to get into the patrol base, so you have to do your security properly, and at the same time, you don't have any running water, you have no internet, you're eating ration boxes for 7 months, and you have to really apply yourself and be disciplined, and disciplined with your soldiers as well, in order to continue the fight, to go out every day, because if you don't go out, then you're going to start getting encircled, and it's very difficult to get out and dominate the ground if you don't keep doing it. And for me, that was kind of the purest form of soldiering. That's what I joined to do. And it was certainly the best time professionally that I had. What
about your colleagues in the military? If they were sat in your chair now, and I said to some other guys, what do you think of Johnny Mercer? What do you think they'd say? Come on, give me an honest answer to that.
I don't know. I think, look, I just did my best, right? I think they probably thought I was a bit mad. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the fight. I enjoyed getting out there. But at the same time, I'd like to think I was sensible, and I didn't take unnecessary risks. But we were successful, right? I mean, we were extraordinarily successful during that time. There's a real kind of skill set to it. And I was honoured to kind of walk with these guys and girls who I thought were incredibly special.
Looking at Afghanistan as it is now, was it worth it?
Look, I'll never say these things are a waste of time, because you can't control the outcome, like where we are now. And there's a whole generation of young people who've grown up in Afghanistan with an idea of what freedom and what a decent life could be, with a level of life chances and security that their parents could only have dreamed of. Has it ended up as we would like? No, of course it's not. But I'll never say it was all a waste of time. I also think, there's something to be said for when your society and when your way of life is under threat. There's something to be said for those who don't just kind of tweet about it and, make, online statements about standing up for freedoms and so on. Those who actually, when the bell tolls, they actually sign up, they go and serve, and they test themselves in the most extraordinary environments that known to man. And they deliver, and they show those amazing qualities that we aspire to have around, courage and commitment and selflessness. I think they're really special people, and I obviously, all of those who died and are injured permanently from that war, my heart goes out to them and their families. But I'm afraid I'm not one of those who thinks all these things are a waste of time. I think you've got to try. I think there's a nobility in trying. And I'm really proud of my service and more so of others who I was lucky enough to serve alongside.
How did you deal with the situation when close colleagues died?
Oh, look, it's obviously horrendous. There are sort of different levels to it. I mean, there's a great degree of shock. I think there's a difference really between if someone, for example, gets a catastrophic injury and then it becomes a kind of real fight to save their life, and you kind of switch into a mode where you're trying to stop the bleeding or whatever it may be, and there's a kind of detachment in that, and then it doesn't really hit you until later. But when you're on the ground and someone's just shot in the face and their lights are out and that's it, it's over. It's extremely frightening. Yeah, you see the consequences of close combat, and but that's when it counts, right? And that's when you've got to earn your pay, get on with what you're doing. Those are the consequences of close combat, and if you're not prepared to deal with that, then don't sign up in the first place.
You've had a fatality in your unit, and how do you keep your men on side then and keep their, for want of a better word, their morale up when they, as their group leader?
Well, these guys are not, they're not stupid, right?
No.
They know that these are the consequences of engaging in these activities. They believe in what they're doing. It's not a conscription army. And a lot of them are self-motivators. They're good people. They're switched on. They're disciplined. They're courageous. Obviously, there are moments when it comes down to you. Yeah, absolutely. As a junior leader, I think that's when you really earn your crust. But also, it's a real privilege to command men in combat, and so those are my reflections on it.
What about the sort of the well-known gallows humour of the British soldier? What kind of moments did you have there where you were dealing with?
Well, there's loads of it. You're going out the door, and that patrol is not going to come to a natural end. You know that you're going to get ambushed, right? And you'll either try and fight through the enemy position, or the majority of the time you try and extract from that contact. So obviously what's going to happen, right? So clearly there's a lot of banter around all that, it's pretty
give
funny.
Me an example.
I remember being with another guy who we thought two of us had crept up onto this enemy position, and he was directly in front of us firing on our colleagues. And one of our colleagues fired into a chicken coop right next to us and blew up all these chickens and gave our position away. I mean, mad stuff happens in contact, right? But that's why, for me, it was at the pinnacle of in some ways what you can do as a young man, because it's not so much about other people, it's what you learn about yourself and your weaknesses and how you become a better person. And for me, that's what combat was about, and I'm very pleased I did it. But of course, I'm happy to move on with my life now.
Do you have any lasting scars?
No, I don't think so. I think I've been very lucky in that. That luck certainly emanates a degree of guilt, and that has obviously driven my life ever since then. I never for 1 minute thought I'd be a kind of veterans campaigner or advocate, certainly back then, but life takes us where it takes us, and you play the cards you're dealt.
Why did you leave? Because you've said that you'd enjoyed it very much. What changed?
Oh, look, it was really straightforward. I mean, throughout that period, and so I was in Afghanistan in 06, 8 to 9 and 10 as well. And I became fed up of the way our country looked after veterans, and that would contrast pretty starkly with certainly when I was with the unit from down here, meeting prime ministers and foreign secretaries. They're sort of what I would call performative remembrance and respect. And that was having kind of real life consequences for my generation of junior commanders. And I guess, I struggled with the aftercare, but it was the mental health care that really struck me, because I'd seen some pretty brutal stuff in Afghanistan that I guess before, I wasn't a kind of naysayer around mental health, but it didn't really affect me. And in that incredibly selfish way, you're always slightly, what's going on here. But I remember, I had a great friend who was a policeman actually, and we used to conduct SSE on target, so you go and find out who you've actually killed. Really intelligent guy, great fun, loads of banter, and we used to, obviously in the old days, we used to have ECBA plates, and then we got Osprey, which is a bit bigger. And then one day they had this great idea where you could stick 2 plates, one down either side. And then you've got this kind of wraparound body armour. And because we were getting ambushed every day, it's probably the right thing to do, put it in. But I decided that I was kind of too heavy already, right? Because I had a couple of radios and I was talking to helicopters and so on. So I left them out so that I could run a bit faster. And this guy I was with, he put his in. We ran out on an ambush, got absolutely smashed, and he got shot in the side and it pinged off his plate. Got back to camp and I'd extracted the casualties through the MERT, and then about 20 minutes later I got called to the ops room. They were like, there's another casualty, and I was like, how have we missed one? And this poor guy was just sat down at the HLS with the medic, and he was kind of dumb, he couldn't speak, and basically what had happened, his brain just could not physically process the fact that he'd put a plate in that morning and been shot, and it had saved his life. And, when you start seeing these traumas up close, you're like, it's not really good enough just because it doesn't affect you not to have treatment for these people. And then that compounded, obviously, through other people's experiences, my friends, certainly, my cohort of junior officers, some of them from 2-9. And then in 2012, there was a programme by the BBC, actually, on Panorama, which highlighted how more veterans and serving personnel killed themselves in 2012 than they were killed in Afghanistan that year, which was still a relatively high intensity operation. I just remember there was one of them, a guy called Dan Collins, who was a Lance Sergeant in one of the Welsh regiments, and he made a video for his mum before he did it. And I just remember looking at him and looking in his eyes, and I recognised a lot of my soldiers in those eyes. I recognised a bit of myself, and I just thought, this has to change, right? This cannot be right that we operate like this in 2012. And if no one else is going to do it, then I'm driven by that kind of sense of responsibility. You could call it guilt or whatever. I thought, right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to try and be an MP. So I left the army and I stood for Parliament.
You went to Plymouth, and you were advised against it because it was a Labour...
Well, I was already in Plymouth, right? Because 2-9 is obviously based in Plymouth, my parent unit. And I wanted to stand in Plymouth, but Plymouth's traditionally been quite a Labour stronghold, and I wasn't particularly political. I didn't vote, but if I did vote, I suppose I would have voted Conservative. But they said, look, you're not going to get in Plymouth, right? They elected Michael Foot a little while ago. He's very left-wing. You're not going to do it. But I thought to myself, look, why do people not vote? I didn't vote. My wife didn't vote. And it's basically because you have such a dim view of politicians, right? So I thought, do you know what? If I can knock on every door in Plymouth, introduce myself, and then they don't like me and they don't vote for me, that's fine. But at least I've given them the opportunity. And so that's what I did, really. I mean, I worked on building sites, raised a bit of money. I left before my pension point, which was incredibly stupid, but raised a bit of money and bought a van, printed out my own leaflets, marked up a map of Plymouth, marked every house on it. I went door knocking for like 5.5 months with my wife, who's just amazing at it. And it was an incredible education. I learned so much about what people want from politics. It's not actually that complicated. Most people are not political. But it was a real privilege. And then, bizarrely I won and I got in 2015.
Well, maybe not so bizarrely, because, you must have touched the hearts of your local community.
Sure, but if people who have been involved in politics for 30 years say you've got less than a 1% chance of winning, you'd have to be pretty boned not to pick up on that, right? I mean, I thought the conversations were good on the doors, but I didn't. I mean, I think the majority of it was probably my wife. She is a lot better than me. I'd come out of relatively specialist units, hadn't even served with women, right? So it was quite an experience to go from that to door knocking and talking about politics. When I say I hadn't served with women, obviously there were no women in 2-9 at that point. Knocking on doors, talking about politics was a completely different, kettle of fish.
How did you deal with the sort of the personal interactions then? Because it's very different. So, dealing with civilians to dealing with military people, isn't it?
It can be, but everyone, a lot of the people's wants and desires are the same around good political representation, and I really enjoyed it because it opened my eyes to other people's lives, and also how really tough some people's lives are through no fault of their own, and how they need government to work, right? I mean, most people in my circles, we try and avoid the government at any cost and get a bit annoyed with tax rises. Actually, if you're in the bottom 20-30% of earners, you heavily rely on government to allow you to increase the amount of money you earn without paying tax. You're a heavy user of the NHS, you rely on social housing, and those are the people I want government to work for.
So how do you feel that the 2024 general election, for example, had an incredibly low turnout of voters, isn't it? How does that make you feel?
Well, because we were terrible by the end of it. The Conservatives had completely fallen apart, and it was pretty heartbreaking to watch, not just for me and on a personal level, but for the people who need a good, modern, compassionate Conservative Party to run this country properly. I mean, people thought it couldn't get any worse. I mean, I think they recognise that that was probably the wrong calculation now. But we had been in for 14 years. We made many mistakes. And I think it was the natural order of things that we were going to lose. And you have to accept that in the correct manner.
We'll come back to that in a little bit. But going back to your early days as a politician, how did you find dealing with like the mandarins in the background?
I always found them okay to me. I mean, obviously you get your cases where they don't quite understand the construct of the civil service and the elected branch, if you like, and the decision making aspect versus the advice aspect. But I must say, in my experience, I had some incredible civil servants who worked really hard. I, in the end, set up a new government department, right? So, you have to have good people who believe in what you're doing in order to do that, and I did have them. So I recognise that there's a kind of anti-civil servant kind of mentality, but speaking from my own experience, I didn't really experience that. Say for one or two occasions on specialist subjects like trying to protect Northern Ireland veterans, and in the end it was kind of sheer force of will and personality that got that through. But broadly speaking, I found some very good and capable civil servants, that we're lucky to have.
Did you feel that the Conservative governments that you served under, did they do enough to help veterans as a whole, regardless of yourself and your own views, but the party as a whole, the government as a whole?
Well, clearly, before I went in, no, and it wasn't really a party issue. But I have to be honest, my journey was not straightforward in the Conservative Party, right? So, when I first came in, people thought it was great and kind of sweet and all the rest of it. Nothing really changed. A lot of that had to do with Brexit and all the rest of it. But look, at the end of the day, the Conservative government came in and parked me out of the equation. They introduced a new government department for veterans. We now spend £6.5 billion a year on veterans. We've got programmes across health, housing, education, employment that we did not have before, and those have been introduced by a Conservative government. So, clearly, politicians do care about this stuff, but you're competing with lots of other issues that are going on at the time, and I think there's a real misunderstanding as to how difficult politics can be, and we're seeing that now with the new administration as well. And I do think, whilst not many people will have a dimmer view of politicians than me, and that's why I became an MP, I think there is at the same time a misunderstanding of how it works and how difficult it can be.
Did going into politics change your views of life?
No, I mean, no. I became an MP because I didn't like MPs, right? And those views only ever really got worse. But obviously there are some good individuals in there, and I was lucky to work with them. And when we did work together, we delivered some good stuff.
You had a mixed relationship with Prime Ministers over your time in office. What did you find the most difficult in dealing with Prime Ministers?
Well, look, I mean, people I think have often consistently misunderstood why I was doing politics, and they kind of view it through their own prism, right? So for me, politics was always about getting things done for people who need it, right, and using it as a vehicle to get things done. And so I found it frustrated when that collided with people who had a different view of politics, in that it was a way to kind of be somebody and stand on top of a machine and kind of make it about you. So that was always difficult, I think. And I always felt this, I mean, I did struggle with it in the early years, but I felt this overwhelming sense of responsibility and pressure, I think, so particularly for the Northern Ireland veterans is a good case in point. I remember Dennis Hutchins, my friend from down in Plymouth, he phoned, I remember where I was when he phoned me up and I was thinking about leaving the government over Northern Ireland veterans, and he said, Johnny, at some point you've got to decide who you're in this for. No one stood up for me before. And that's when I knew really that you have to decide whose side you're on. And it was a no-brainer because I knew whose side I was on all along. So, swings and roundabouts.
Choosing sides, that's a recurring theme really, isn't it? And the inquiry into alleged war crimes in Afghanistan, that was a very difficult time for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very difficult.
I watched some of the tribunals, going on, and I felt, when I was looking at you, I felt conflicted was the word that described you. What was going through your mind when you were getting some of those really difficult questions?
Well, it's pretty straightforward, really. I mean, I've campaigned for 7, 8, 9 years to end the vexatious pursuit of my generation of combatants from Iraq and Afghanistan who were hounded by the likes of Phil Shiner and human rights lawyers. I extended that back into Northern Ireland where, people who'd taken part in the conflict were now in political positions and trying to change the history of it and go after veterans from that conflict. I'd spent, 7, 8, 9 years doing that, and then suddenly right at the end, something comes along that is very clear to those of us who operated in that space what has happened, and you feel all sorts of things. You feel huge disappointment. You feel a sense of betrayal because you feel like you've kind of gone into bat for this organisation, and then you've kind of been cut off at the legs, despite even challenging the most senior people in that organisation to be like, tell me what's going on here so that we can adjust accordingly. And I felt, I still feel just really kind of deflated by the whole thing. It really did take the shine off my time in public life.
You famously refused to name whistleblowers and were threatened with a fine or going to prison even, weren't you?
Yeah.
Would you have gone to prison? Would you have stuck to your principles?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer for me, right? It wasn't even, I didn't actually find it that hard because it wasn't something kind of up for debate. Like difficult decisions and when you wrestle with them at night or whatever, like, it was never going to happen, right? I'd given my word to these individuals. I was never going to give up their names. The judge obviously did what he had to do and exerted a degree of pressure on me, but that was only going to end one way, really, because of my mindset on it. And I recognised that sometimes these things have a price, and I was willing to pay that price, of course, because I think there's a much greater issues at stake. But I think we'll see where the inquiry goes. It's not nice, being on the front of the paper and your kid running up to you with a headline that says Mercer's going to prison. So I think it was all a bit unnecessary. But that's the sport I was in, and I take that on the chin.
So how did it impact your family then? I mean, you say it's not nice, and clearly it isn't. But your children were coming across this at school or whatever.
Yeah, well, it was on the front of the Telegraph one day, and we were canvassing down in Plymouth, and someone had given it to I think she was 10 at the time, Joey. Said, "Oh, have you seen your dad's in the paper?" They gave her the front page, and she ran up to me on the street with this front page, and it said Mercer heading to prison or something. And I just thought, this is insane. Like, why do we do this? Why do I do this job? And all the rest of it. But look, I'm incredibly lucky with my family, and I think it's the primary reason why I've been able to go and do stuff. There's certainly nothing kind of remarkable about me from my service days or anything like that. What is remarkable is my family and that bedrock that I've got, and my wife and children. And it just helps me put everything else into perspective and keeps me grounded, and helps me to sort of judge who I should listen to and who I shouldn't, and try and keep on true north, and keep going.
When I was doing my research, I spoke to some members of UK Special Forces, and one of the questions was from them when
Yeah.
in the discussion was, why did you give evidence at the inquiry? Because you mentioned that there was nothing, that you fought very hard to try and disprove the allegations, but that you were unable to do so.
Yeah.
And a comment that was given to me, and here's your chance to confirm or deny, was that by saying that, you actually left them feeling that they'd been thrown under a bus, and that they felt that the implication was that it was all true, and therefore they were all bad people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of wildly misrepresentative of what's going on. No one has fought harder to protect those units than me. I was ordered to give evidence because of the role I was in at the time and what I was asked to do by the Secretary of State, which was to look into it. But ultimately, you know, I'm not in anyone's pocket, right? I don't owe anybody anything. I've got nothing to prove to anyone. Whatever unit you're in, whatever you've done, the evidence is what matters. And the truth is as well, I'm very proud of my generation's service in Afghanistan, right? And if you did not uphold those traditions and you behaved in a way that is not in line with those standards and values and ethos, the vast majority of people, performed to, but also sacrificed for in Afghanistan, you're not going to find a friend in me, I'm afraid. I'm not. I have obviously very strong loyalties to that cohort, but at the same time, my sort of values and what I believe in trump everything, and you have to. It's a big integrity shout. It was a massive integrity shout, right? I'd campaigned for years to protect these people, and then suddenly evidence is presented is coming out now, but far more is to come, and ultimately you're accountable to yourself, aren't you? And you have to be able to look that in the eye. So look, I mean, I haven't had a lot of jip off UKSF community, if I'm honest with you. I've had a lot of support, in particular from the Northern Ireland generation, who've said to me very clearly that this is not what this community is about. And I know that because obviously I served with that community in 2008 and 9. So, I think those who defend this sort of behaviour are outliers. And I've, absolutely no qualms in pointing that out. But also, I'm also always open to a conversation, and I will sit down with anyone from that era who's in the midst of this and have a very frank conversation with them. And I'd encourage anyone who has any real issues to get hold of me, and I'm more than happy to speak to them.
This one's a long question. Colonel Harry Summers, in his 1982 book on strategy, A Critical Analysis of the Vietnam War, famously put one of the reasons for the failure of Vietnam down to the fracturing of the relationship between the state, the military and the people. Now, we've already talked about the Afghan unlawful killings inquiry, and you've butted heads with Lord Justice Sir Charles Haddon Cave. Do you feel that post-Afghan and Iraq, we're at a similar nadir in the relationship between the public and our military, hence low recruiting and poor retention? I told you.
Look, I think you got to bear the Afghan inquiry in perspective, right? It involves a very small cohort of very particular people at a very particular time, right? So you just need to kind of leave that as a standalone subject and let it reach its own conclusions. It's the relationship between the military and the state fracturing. I think the Northern Ireland issue is particularly pertinent because there's a classic case where these people have been investigated already. They're now very elderly. The environment over there has changed, where you have those who took part in the conflict. A good example is Jerry Kelly, who's on the policing board in Northern Ireland, shot a prison officer in the head in the 70s. They now have positions in society in Northern Ireland where they can shift the balance and put their foot on the scales. And I think we have a a responsibility to look after those who went out there, did the very best they could. You know, if they did make errors, they were investigated at the time, and leave that be. I don't think it's right to look at what happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s through the prism of 2025, retrospectively apply those standards and perspectives. I think it's a dreadful betrayal of UK veterans, and that's why I brought in a law to change it.
Yeah, and you fought very hard because the law originally was for overseas operations, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
And you tried to bring that to apply to Northern Ireland as well. And you stuck to your principles on that.
Yeah, I mean, the government that I was part of at the time tried to get it through just for my generation. But, you know, like Dennis Hutchins had said to me, no one had stuck up for them before, and I was determined to do that. So I resigned from that government, I left the government, and I then went on a massive campaign, which resulted in the 2023 Act that put a stop to these inquests and inquiries and focused on truth and reconciliation.
So how do you feel that the current regime is basically undoing your
Yeah,
work?
very bitter. I mean, they're very dishonest the way they represent it. I think they know they're dishonest about it. You know, they have a different approach. You know, with Keir Starmer and Richard Herman, his Attorney General, who, you know, was involved with Jerry Adams and all the rest of it. And I would respect their approach more if they were honest about why they were doing it. So they're saying things, you know, they're calling my act an immunity act. Well, it wasn't, right? You didn't get immunity. You got a degree of legal protection if you cooperated with a commission that was set up to find the truth and find out what happened to these. You actually go and spend time with these families like I have in Northern Ireland. They don't really want to see 80-year-olds in prison, right? They want to know what happened to their loved ones in their final moments. They want to know that their loved ones mattered. You are not going to get that with the threat of prosecution. No one's going to say anything, and these people will take these stories to their graves. The only people who get anything out of it are lawyers, and it's basically a cash machine, the inquest procedure for lawyers. And, you know, this government's made a decision to be on their side rather than either victims, families, or the principle of looking after those who you go to serve on your behalf in the military.
With the Good Friday Agreement, there was, to use your word, immunity was given to what most people would term as terrorists, wasn't there? So,
well, it wasn't immunity. What they did was they released a lot of all of the Good Friday Agreement offences out of prison. Yeah.
And they've faced no further action since, whereas British soldiers might...
Yeah, I mean, the unfairness of it is stark, right? And I think it's desperate, and it makes me extremely sad. It's one of the things I found life pretty good leaving public life, to be honest, and I've had a great time, but I did not expect the next government's come in and then steadily unpick everything I'd done. I kind of expected them not to have an interest in the same things that I was trying to do, but I didn't expect them to meticulously undo what I'd done, whilst kind of lying about it as well, you know, saying it was unlawful and so on. Actually, it was signed off by the Attorney General at the time. A judge in Northern Ireland found it conflated with human rights law. You know, the Irish were suing us. We were going to fight them in Strasbourg. Certainly when I was there was a 90% chance of us winning that. You know, the idea the Irish government should have a role in what happens to our veterans in Northern Ireland is absurd. But you know, that's the route they've started to go down. I just wish they had a bit more integrity about it.
I don't really understand why they feel the need to undo what.
Well, this is it, right? Because anything difficult like that, just being in government, being in cabinet, you would just leave it and you blame the previous government.
Yeah, well, we're seeing that a lot, aren't we?
And no, but there's lots of other things you can worry about and lots of other things to tackle in this country at the moment. So I don't understand why they're doing it either.
The role that you had as a member of the Privy Council and a member of the cabinet.
Yeah.
Am I correct? The Labour government they tried to downgrade that, didn't they?
Well, they didn't try. They have.
They have. Okay.
So yeah, Keir Starmer promised the country during the election that he would have a veterans minister in his cabinet, and promptly cancelled it on his first day. Yeah. I remember him looking at me in the eye on Armistice Day in 2023, I think it was, and saying, talking to me about the Office of Veterans Affairs, how it sits outside the MOD and it's successful, and I said to him, you need to keep it there. And, veterans who need help, they don't really want to go to the MOD. They want to go to a different place. And that's how we've been successful and run all these programs across government. And he was like, yeah, I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep it. He did ask me how much money it costs to run. I told him that. And then he was like, yeah, I'm going to keep it. I'll keep a veterans minister in my cabinet. He looked me in the eye and said that. And then just went straight against his word. So, this, I recognise this as politics, but I mean the dishonest nature of it, I think, has been extremely difficult over the years.
That's conflicting again for you, isn't it? You come across, I mean, we've not really met before, and you come across as a very principled, very honest and open guy, and that must have been quite difficult.
I'm not a monk, right?
No.
But I do think it's right to shoot straight, particularly when these issues aren't. I'm not going to get prosecuted for Northern Ireland, right? There's nothing in this for me.
No.
But you're dealing with people, a really special cohort of people. I mean, last year I went walking with. I spent a lot of time with veterans groups, right? Yeah. So I went out with people who did things like the Lockall operation in Northern Ireland. I've been,
what do you think of that? The way that these guys are being pursued?
Well, it's awful, absolutely awful. I mean, what that was a good professional job on murdering thugs.
For those that don't know, the people involved in that had allegedly attacked a police station
they'd already tipped the bomb over the top through the digger, and were running through the gate, spraying machine gun fire, and they ended up dead. I mean, what do you expect?
Yeah. Let's move it on to other aspects of veterans' life. We've touched on it already, but mental health is a big thing. I mentioned Mick Hawkes earlier, and he sat in that chair and openly was weeping because he had nearly committed suicide.
Yeah.
And Mick was in the SAS, and it wasn't to do with his career in the SAS.
No, I'm sure.
It was to do with having left the military, feeling valueless.
Yeah. And that is it's so true, right? I mean, the vast majority of people don't leave the military with mental health problems and all the rest of it. Generally they're greatly enhanced by their time in service. It's a real life chances accelerator being in the military. Look, resettling is tough and readjusting is tough. I'm finding it now, right? This is the first time in 24 years I haven't been in an institution, right? I joined up at 19, left that, went straight into government, went straight into Parliament, went into the cabinet. I'm now wild and free, right? And it's not easy. That's why veterans care is so important, but that's why it's important as well. It's not in the Ministry of Defence because you're not serving anymore, right? You're not a serving personnel. You're a veteran. You're a member of society, and we don't want to create hordes and battalions of veterans who just hang out in veterans clubs and talk to other veterans. You want good citizens who have served, right? And all you need to do to that is just make civilian society work for them properly. So any disadvantages they may have had by moving around the whole time and not having a good credit score and being unable to get a mortgage, these are all slowly ironed out, whether it's around education, whether it's around access to healthcare, whatever it may be. And that's, what I was on a mission to do. That's what the Office of Veterans Affairs was doing very successfully. I mean, I brought in Op Courage, the UK's first dedicated mental health care pathway for veterans, £22 million a year. It had 15,000 referrals in its first year. Op Fortitude was a homelessness pathway I set up, and in Christmas 22 or 23, I can't remember which one it was, we had no one sleeping rough. Homelessness is a different issue. You can self-declare yourself homeless. Nobody was sleeping rough because of a lack of provision. No veterans at that Christmas. So, it can be done, but you do need... Politics is a fight about not only externally and what, with your detractors, but internally about trying to get the government care about the right stuff, and you have to be able to go and fight for that. I was really lucky in that I had Rishi Sunak as a Prime Minister who genuinely believed in this stuff, and I was able to get money out of other departments and knit together government to make it work properly for people who really needed it. But you've got to fight, and you've got to fight your own side, and I think that's what we didn't see before, and obviously we haven't seen that since.
What's your opinion of Operation Valour?
I welcome it. I think there's a real attitude in society at the moment to shout about what you're against the whole time, right? And so this new administration gets a hard time. I mean, I do think rightfully so, particularly when it comes to Northern Ireland, but you can't apply a blanket naysayer approach to that. Oh, Valor is great, 50 million quid, right? Trying to knit together all of the different veteran services is absolutely what's needed, and I really want to see it succeed.
One of the people who sent in a question around Operation Valor said, is it money down a rabbit hole? And is it really going to make a difference because it's 50 million spread over time, spread over the whole of the UK, and is it enough, I suppose?
Yeah, look, the last thing you need in this sector is more and more money thrown at it, right? There's a lot of services. It's like $1 billion a year industry. You need to find a way of making that whole system and connecting that system up better. And Valor's going to work to that. I actually think the advent of things like AI and tech presents us with that opportunity as well. And I've been working with some both in the UK and in Ukraine to make that reality. A lot of people want to help veterans now, but there's still an unmet need. And you've got to find a way of connecting those who need it with the service faster, more localised, more professionalised, not only services, but opportunities in employment and civilian employment, stuff like that. And I think that's where the fight is now. So I think Valor's, on the right track.
You mentioned Ukraine. Ukraine has been seeing quite a shift in the way that warfare is conducted. There's a lot more drone technology, for example. How do you think warfare is going to change in the short term? And also, extending from that question, what about the risk to Europe of a wider war?
Look, I think we live in extraordinarily frightening times. I think we've underinvested in defence for a long time, including in my government, even though there were significant uplifts. I think Europe's got fat and happy on the American dollar. And this is the frustrating thing about Trump is that, a lot of what he says is correct in that space.
Perhaps not the way he says it sometimes.
Well, you can shoot the messenger, but you can't change the truth, right? And the truth is that Europe's defence has been carried by the Americans. Why are 500 million Europeans asking 350 million Americans to keep them safe from 110 million Russians? It's insane, right? So we're seeing that process go through at the moment. I think it's extremely frightening. I think the Russian state clearly has no boundaries at the moment. But there are reasons to be cheerful as well, right? So technologically and militarily, we are so far advanced of these people. We were all told what a huge threat the Russian army was, and they couldn't even get to Kyiv, right, without running out of petrol. So we need to be realistic, but we need to be professional and be configured correctly to deal with what is it, change in warfare, and it's very different, certainly from my time in service.
I've got a sobering stat here. In 2023, BAE manufactured enough shells in the whole of the year to last the Russian army 48 hours at current levels of expenditure. How do we reset our manufacturing base to react in line with the changes in this conflict?
Sure. Well, the time I spent out there has really shown me how warfare for them is kind of really baked into society, right? So it's kind of a function of the state. And so yes, you have your sharp end where that's happening, but there's all this infrastructure built around it, around industry and so on. And I think that's the kind of change we have to undergo as a nation. I think we've cashed in this peace dividend after the Cold War many times over. We've then had a counter-terrorism phase, which I was involved in, which again, at times was obviously it was brutal and it was difficult, but we weren't losing 1 million men like the Russian state has done. So look, I think these changes are all going through, and we've got to keep up with the pace and make sure that we protect the country properly.
Spending public money, the government's revenue, if you like, is about choices.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to make some choices. We've either got to increase our military spend or we've got to spend more money on the NHS. But it's going to be difficult to do both, isn't it?
It's about choices. And this government's decided to spend more on welfare and to tax middle earners in order to pay for welfare. Clearly, I don't agree with that. But there's been an election and the Labour Party won, so we have to see that through.
Do you see yourself returning to politics?
Look, I never really wanted to return, but it's pretty hard to watch the house burn down and do nothing about it. I've had 10 years of frontline experience in that space, and I'm a patriot, and I believe in the country and what we can do when we all work together. So never say never.
What about reform? And I mean, there's a very real chance if you believe in the polls, that they would be elected as the next government.
Yeah, so if you look at the polls, that's what we're on track for. I think reform I understand why people vote for them, but I think they're being sold a lie. I think the solutions, if you see that they're putting forward, this idea of the last election, everyone under £20,000 wouldn't pay income tax, with absolutely no effort to explain what that would do to health services and all these. I think it's fundamentally dishonest, and they're playing on all the insecurities that we know we all face. But in some ways, I wouldn't, criticise that. I would criticise the Conservative Party for allowing that gap to open up, right? And we need to step into that and show that actually we can grip these issues, whether it's around immigration or the boats coming over the channel. That is appalling, and it has to stop. And my party has been in power and has not stopped it, right? So I respect that, but that's where the party's gone wrong, really. We need to double down on our real core values, of which that is one.
We've seen lots of examples over the last few years of, for want of a better word, sleaze in politics, and the Labour government largely got in on criticism of the previous Tory government.
Yeah.
But it hasn't really improved, has it?
Well, no, it's got worse. But it's not a surprise to those of us who knew them. We've been floating around the bars of Westminster with this lot for 10 years, and the idea that they're serious operators is for the birds. But it's our fault, right?
Yeah.
Because
they'd say the same about you, to be fair.
Well,
Not you
yeah, but at
personally,
least,
I'm talking about
we dealt with challenges such as COVID or Ukraine and Brexit. What's their excuse?
I hear constant, Rachel Reeves talking about the black hole that she inherited, which has never actually been proven.
Well, the IFS couldn't find this black hole.
That's right, yeah. It's conveniently forgotten there was COVID, there was a lockdown, and I think Rishi Sunak, his hands were largely tied, and without some of the actions that he took, in my view, and I'm coming off my neutral seat here, but in my view, he did some very, very good things.
Look, Rishi's, I was proud to serve in Rishi's cabinet. He's a principled man. He believes in what he's doing. He's a good man. He's got a good family, and I'll always support him. Did he get everything right? Of course he didn't, right? But it's an imperfect sport, and you got to be careful who you vote for. And I think people are feeling that now.
If you were looking back on your life, what would you do differently?
Well, you do ask yourself that, but I was very, I've always been very forthright with my prime ministers about where I think we are and where we're doing well and where we're not doing so well, and that's got me in trouble sometimes. But it does mean that I can leave knowing that I did everything I could to shape the direction of the country. And so, would I do things differently? Look, I went into politics very young. I was 35. I messed around a lot. I enjoyed winding people up. I love the fight. I wouldn't do that if I went back again, right? It's a serious endeavour. It's a serious calling. And, looking after this country is a serious job of work. I very much miss people like David Cameron, who I got into politics for. I never voted before Cameron came along. That's my sort of politics. It's been a very difficult ride since, but I felt like I had to kind of hang on and deliver this stuff for veterans, and I'm really proud that we did.
Well, if I can add a little bit to that, Johnny, compared to me, you're still young, right? And I've got 20 years plus on you, and so you've still got time to to stick to your views and bring and make them in the public domain. So use it.
We'll see.
What's in the short term?
Time with my wife and children. My wife has followed me around for 20 years, and she's an extremely talented woman. She set up her own business. She's going great guns. I want to support her. I want to get your children are only young once, right? And I want to get them through school and make sure that they're off on the straight and narrow. And then we'll see, But I've been working pretty hard since I was a teenager. So I'm happy to.
I saw a photograph of you laying some bricks.
Yeah, I've been doing that. I've done all sorts of things. I love working with my tools, working with my hands. Good, honest day's work, and then get down the pub with the boys. It's good. But I'm happy and a lot happier than I was. But we'll see what the future holds.
Johnny, I've really enjoyed it, and we've overrun. But hey, it's been good, yeah.
Good.
And,
no, pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Real pleasure.
Right?
Yeah.
Nice to see you, Chris.
Thanks very much. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Johnny's been a great guest, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks very much. Bye now.